In my last video, we were looking at this data set and we focused on the variable quality rating here, which is categorical or qualitative. In this video, we're going to focus on a quantitative variable, the meal price. And so again, in this data set, we have 300 observations of restaurants and the rating of whether the meal was good, very good, or excellent, and how much did the meal cost. What we're going to do is kind of similar to what we did in the last video. We're going to make a frequency distribution, and then we're going to graph the frequency distribution. I just want to point out that when you make a graph that looks like this, with columns going up, in statistics normally we'll call this a bar graph. A bar graph, whether the bars go left to right or up and down, generally I think most statisticians prefer them going up and down. We call this a bar graph. When we make a similar graph for meal price, a quantitative variable, we're going to call that kind of graph a histogram. Histogram. I just want to introduce that term, and I'll go into the details about what that means and how it's going to be a little bit different from a bar graph when we get there. So in order to make a frequency distribution for a quantitative variable, what you have to do is decide a little bit differently from a categorical variable. Here we just count up how frequently good appears. How often, how frequently does very good appear. For a quantitative variable, you don't just want to count up how often you see each individual number. You're going to want to group the numbers into groups, which in statistics sometimes we'll call a class or a bin. Let's use the pivot table tool in order to do this. Before we look at the pivot table, let's just get a little bit of a feel for these meal prices. How low do they go and how high do they go? And like I did in the last video, I love to use this. Go to highlight the column, go to data, and then filter. And when you hit filter, a little drop down arrow happens here or appears here. And what you do is click that, and this is a very quick way to get a list of all the unique values of meal price. And so we see it's kind of going to be small on your screen, but the lowest is $10 and the highest goes up to $48 for the meal price. Just want to get a sense for the range here. We're going from 10 to 48. That's a range of about $38. Okay. Now let's just go to the pivot table tool and let's make a frequency distribution, and then we'll use that information to make a graph. So let's highlight the data, and before you use the pivot table tool, you want to make sure that the data you're interested in is all in a column and there is a title. There has to be a label at the top here that is not actually one of your data points. So I'm going to highlight all the data. And to use the pivot table tool, go to Insert, Pivot Table. And again, there are lots of options you can mess with here. I ignore them and I just hit OK. So here is our pivot table work area. And again, in this case, since we're just looking at one variable, meal price, what we want to do is drag with our left click with the mouse button, drag the meal price variable down to where it says rows, and look at what it does. It lists all those unique values, just like what we saw when we used the filter before. So I guess we wouldn't have to do that because we can get a picture that the values go from 10 to 48 here. And then what we want to do is left click with the mouse again and drag meal price down here to where it says values. Now before I let go, I want you to look carefully at what this says. It says sigma, uppercase sigma, which means add up values. And what this does is this reveals to you Excel's preference. If you drag a variable with numbers into this values area, what it's going to want to try to do most of the time is add up the values rather than count up how frequently they occur. And we really want the count, not them added up. And let's look at what Excel did. It's telling us the sum of the meal prices. What we want is the count of how many are $10, how many are $11. But instead of doing that, it's adding up. So really what this 70 is telling us is that there are 7 meals that cost $10, and it's adding up 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 to get $70. That's not what we want in a frequency distribution. So what we're going to have to do is go down here. Again, this is going to be very small on your screen. I apologize, to where it says sum of meal price. Click this little down arrow and go to value field settings. And instead of sum, we want to do count. Now, we didn't have to do this in the previous video when we were working with a categorical variable, because you can't add up words. Excel by default kind of wants to add things up. So we changed that to count, and it fixes it. And it tells us this is now the count of how many times each of these meal prices occur. And now we don't have those large totals anymore. Another way to see that what's going on here is correct is that the total number of observations is 300. If we reset this back to sum, we're getting some really large number, $7,769 in this case, not observations. So let's just reset that to count. Now again, it's going to be pretty rare that you want to leave a frequency distribution for quantitative data like this, where you're just listing the individual values. What you're probably going to want to do is group them into ranges. And in order to group them, you just have your cursor and hover your cursor over any one of these values and right-click with your mouse and go to the option that says Group. And it says, okay, here's how we're going to group these. We're going to start at 10. That's going to be the lowest start value for one of these groups, or bins, or classes as they're called. It says we're going to end at 48, and we're going to do this by tens, in groups of tens. Let's just click OK and see what happens. That's not too bad. Now, even though Excel told us it was going to start at 10 and end at 48, it actually ended at 49, which makes sense. One of the cardinal or basic rules of making a quantitative frequency distribution like this is you want these classes, these groups, to all have exactly the same width. If you had this first group going from 10 to 19 and the next one from 20 to 35 or 20 to 50, it makes the table very hard to understand. Another side effect is going to make the kind of graph we're going to make, the histogram, in a minute, it's going to make the histogram not make any sense at all. It's going to deceive our eyes when we make a histogram. It's not going to tell the true story in a picture that we want to see. So this is okay. My one concern here is maybe this is not enough bins, not enough classes, not enough categories. So this is before we change this up, we would call this a bin width of 10 or a class width of 10. And don't be tricked. Some people will look at the 10 to 19 and say that's 9. The proper way to think about this is we're going from the start of the numbers that go in this category is 10, and the start of the numbers that go in this category is 20. The difference between those is 10. Another way to think about why this is a bin width of 10 is to count up how many different unique values would go in this category 10 to 19. Well, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and that's 10 different numbers, 10 different values. Let's change this to see what it looks like if we were to change this to a bin width of maybe 5. That's going to give us more categories. The narrower the class, the narrower the bin width, the more categories you have to have in the list. So let's right-click, go to Group again, and instead of by 10, let's tell it by 5, and let's just see what that looks like. I think I like that better. Normally four classes or four groups is not enough to really give you a good picture of what's going on in the data. So I like this. Now, what I always do when I have a pivot table is I want to be able to clean up. I don't like the default titles that Excel gives you. I don't like the fact that this is a grand total. It's just a total. And I want to be able to clean it up. So what I always do is I highlight the information, not those top columns, because those top columns contain some programming related to the pivot table. Copy all the results. So everything not including the top row. I'm going to hit Control C, or you could right click and go to copy, either way. And then I go back to our, say, a results sheet. I'll just move these qualitative results out of the way here. Go to a sheet where I can edit things and make it look a little better. So let me paste that there. And so we want to type some informative titles. So we could call these price bins or price classes or price categories. And here, frequency. And again, I'll make those bold just to make it a little easier to read. Also, again, I'm a big fan of centering things here, so it's a little easier to see what's going on, and we should probably do that at least for the frequencies in this up here. Make it a little easier to read. And instead of grand total, again, I think the word total is sufficient. And we want to make sure that they add up to 300 observations, of course, to make sure nothing was double counted, nothing was left out, and that Excel didn't make any mistakes, because Excel does some strange things from time to time. Now what we want to do, guys, is we want to graph this information. So let's highlight the columns, column headings, and everything but not the total. You don't want a bar that graphs the total observations. That's going to make it look very strange indeed. So highlight this, go to Insert, and we're going to pick a kind of basic column graph. We would call this a bar graph, but Excel likes to call this a column. And there we go. Not a bad start. However, what we're making here is a histogram and not a bar graph. So let's describe some of the differences in what this word histogram means. When you are making a graph of the frequencies or the percent frequency or the relative frequency of a quantitative variable here, we don't call it a bar graph anymore, we call it a histogram. One substantive difference between a bar graph and a histogram is we do not want gaps between the bars. When we're looking at qualitative or categorical data, gaps between the bars are fine, because what that visually tells us is that these are distinct categories. Good, very good, and excellent. But when we're dealing with numerical ranges, these numerical ranges flow from one into the other. There's not a gap between the meal that costs 14 and the meal that costs 15, since we're assuming this data is rounded to the nearest dollar, right? So we want to get rid of the gaps in the bars. So in order to do that, just hover your mouse over one of the bars, right-click, and go to Format Data Series. And the option we want to change here is called gap width, and we just want to set that to 0 when we're making a histogram, when we're looking at quantitative data. And what that does is it lets us see the shape of the data without those big gaps. Now, of course, a couple of other things we want to do when we make either a bar graph or a histogram is we want to have an informative title. So like over here we have restaurant ratings for a title. We also want to label the y-axis to tell people, what is this? Is this frequency? Is this a percent? Or what is it? And since we're making this histogram with frequency here, we want to label that y-axis. So in Excel, if you want to label the axes, the main label here, the main title, easiest way is just to click in this title until the cursor starts blinking, and then you can edit it. So we would call this, meal price histogram, something informative. And we want to make sure people know what's on this y-axis. The x-axis more or less is self-explanatory. We could have a label saying that these are the price bins in dollars, if it wasn't clear. But we do definitely want to label the y-axis. If we want to do that, we can go to Design. So make sure you have the graph selected. Click on Design. And here are all the options for changing the design of the graph. We can go to Add Chart Element, Axis Titles. And what we want to do is add a title for the vertical axis. Primary vertical is what it says. And then we can go here and we can click and we can edit the title. So let's just say this is frequency. And people will know that's just a count of how many of the meals were in each of those ranges. Now, we can, in this table, another thing we might want to do is calculate the percent frequency. Divide each of these numbers by 300 and multiply it by 100 to get percents. And we can make a histogram with the percents. And it's going to look exactly the same. The only difference will be the y-axis will be labeled differently. We could also graph the relative frequency. One final improvement that I might suggest here is, even though this is okay, this is acceptable, I would prefer maybe to see a little outline. You know, we want these categories to run together, no gaps, but it would make it a little easier to see what's going on if we did have an outline here. It's not required, but let's just do that real quick. So again, if you want to change something, right-click on it. And we can say, Format Data Series, probably. And there, you see there are three little images up here. I'm going to click on the bucket. Bucket has to do with the colors. We can change the fill, color, or we can change the border. Here it says automatic, and it has a color, outline color. It looks like it's white, or maybe it's just not there. Let's just choose a different color, like a gray, and see what that looks like. So, okay, I like that. That's not too bad. Now we have a little bit of an outline that gives these columns a little bit of definition, and so we can really identify how many meals were between $10 and $14 and $15 and $19, but they're all running together, and so that makes it a histogram. So once again, to wrap up here, a histogram is what we call this bar graph when we're making it from a frequency distribution based on quantitative data. When you're making a histogram, you have to make a frequency distribution first and then graph that frequency distribution. One mistake sometimes I'll see students make is let's just go ahead and do this for fun. They'll just select the column and they'll go insert graph and they'll make a graph like this. This is a really meaningless exercise when you take all the data you have and you just make a graph of the different values of meal price, for example. This is not helping us understand anything about meal price. It's too busy. It's just nothing more than a list of the data. Visually, it's not summarizing the data. The histogram, from looking at the histogram here, what we can see is how many are in each category. It's a little easier than looking at a table, but it's the same information. Secondly, we can visualize the range. Not only that it goes from 10 to about 49, but how spread out are these meal prices? Well, 10 to 49 is going to be about $40 wide, $40 spread, $40 range here. Another interesting thing you can do with a histogram, and we'll talk about this more in the course as we go on, is you can take a histogram, and if you were to imagine this was a shape made of wood or made of styrofoam, and you could balance this shape anywhere. You had to pick, where am I going to put my finger to where this shape would balance? It wouldn't tip left and it wouldn't tip right. if you can find that point, and I would guess that point is somewhere right around here, what that tells you is approximately what the average is. So by looking at a histogram and getting a little practice, you can visualize what the average is. And again, as we go through the course, we'll be able to visualize some other things from looking at histograms. So this is an important word to know and an important graph to get comfortable with making and interpreting. So this is Berkey Academy signing out. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comment section below. Good luck with your studies.